Mom, I made sure everything was locked up tight. Of course, I didn't forget Dad's cherished shed either.
That's great. Shall we go on our trip then? We were supposed to go on a birthday trip for our daughter, the three of us, including my husband. However, he suddenly had to go on a business trip because of an urgent work matter he couldn't get out of, and just like that, he said we wouldn't be able to go on the trip. After sending off my husband, my daughter and I headed to the airport and flew to our destination. When we returned from the trip, my daughter wanted to give souvenirs to Grandma and Grandpa, so we went to my in-laws' house. The atmosphere there was incredibly tense, and my father-in-law was erupting like an active volcano, absolutely furious. It seems that a terrible accident had occurred while we were away on our trip, and the discoverers were none other than my in-laws. I'm a married woman in my mid-30s. I was assigned to the administrative department of the sales division at the company where I started working after graduating from college. Though I didn't go out on sales calls directly, there were times I had to go outside to assist with various tasks. One time, when I had to deliver some forgotten documents to a client, the person who helped me out was my future husband. Later, we ended up sharing a table at a crowded restaurant during lunchtime, which led us to start dating, and eventually, we got married. I was really enjoying my job at the time, so I proposed to keep working until I got pregnant, and my husband agreed, saying that the idea of a stay-at-home wife was outdated. After finding out I was pregnant, I kept my promise and quit my job to focus on our family and gave birth to our daughter. My romantic history hasn't always been smooth sailing. If anything, I've had experiences that made me timid about love or even left me with traumas. It was mostly from my high school days. I wasn't particularly popular, but I did date to some extent appropriate for my age. Mostly, I ended up in relationships where the other person confessed their feelings to me, but inevitably, they would find someone else they liked more and leave me. When asked why, they would simply say they found someone they liked more than me, which gradually made me more and more wary of love. During my university years, because of these traumas, I didn't participate in any mixers and mostly hung out with girlfriends. If a guy joined the group, I would feel uncomfortable and leave. As a working adult, I decided to keep it strictly professional with men, having coffee or lunch with them, but never considering them as romantic interests. Yet, my husband became a romantic interest, and our relationship led to marriage, which I consider nothing short of a miracle. He was the only one who confessed his feelings for me and didn't leave. My husband was both a good talker and a good listener, always managing to make me laugh. Life with him was lively, every day felt fresh and exciting, and I was truly happy. Then, one day, someone I knew moved nearby. That person was a friend I was very close to when I was in high school. Looking back, it might have been over something trivial, but at the time, it felt significant enough for us to have a falling out. What exactly led us to drift apart, I can't quite remember now. Since our falling out, I hadn't contacted her even once, only hearing about her through mutual friends at reunions. That's how I learned she had gotten married. When we accidentally met again, I was so stiff, not knowing the right way to act. But she approached me cheerfully, as if she had no memory of our quarrel. So, I blurted out, "Emmy?" Because that's what I used to call her. Emmy cheerfully said, "I got divorced." It seems she decided to start fresh and moved to an unfamiliar place. She brightly shared that she's now making a living through part-time jobs. Can you believe running into someone I know here? I'll be honest with you, I was really feeling scared and vulnerable. I'm not used to being alone. I remembered how Emmy always had people around her, always lively. So, I impulsively said, "We're neighbors now, come over anytime." Little did I know, this would lead to something else. Emmy quickly came over, saying she bought some trendy pastries to share with my family. At first, she came over when my husband wasn't home, during weekdays, but gradually, she started saying it was lonely to eat alone and began staying for dinner. Eventually, she got on well with my husband, and before I knew it, she was frequently visiting when my husband was home. Our house was always filled with conversation and laughter. Having Emmy around, and seeing how my husband was friendly towards my friend, I felt truly grateful. However, I started to notice that the closeness between my husband and Emmy was becoming unnatural. Even from a woman's perspective, Emmy is beautiful, and she has a way of talking to anyone without any barriers. In high school, she was adored by both upper and lower class men, and even teachers liked her. She was the kind of person who could befriend anyone. I don't think there is any ulterior motive, yet my husband blushed and acted all smitten around Emmy, sometimes touching her more than necessary. I can somewhat understand a man being charmed by Emmy's looks, but my husband has a wife and child right in front of him. What's with that behavior? My suspicion only grew. Emmy began visiting closer to the evening. Half the week, she was having dinner with my family as if it was a given. But I started making excuses, ensuring she left before my husband came home. Sometimes, I'd forcefully suggest, "How about we have lunch together," to get her out of the house. Initially, Emmy was okay with it, but gradually, she started asking, "Do you have a reason for not wanting me in your house?" And avoiding my husband became increasingly difficult. Despite not wanting my husband and her to get close, I found myself making up reasons to refuse her visits. Things changed after she started coming over. My husband has been into DIY since before we were married and always said he wanted his own shed in the backyard once we tied the knot. A shed wasn't feasible, so we settled for a large storage container that doubles as a workshop. He would spend almost all his days off locked away in there, immersed in his hobby. He brought in a big sofa to lounge on, but he never shooed me or our daughter away. In fact, he'd get passionate about his projects or work on them together with her. Our daughter enjoyed watching things come together so much that there were times she wouldn't leave his side. But recently, he's been chasing her away with a "stay out of the shed," looking furious, and locking himself in. Even when called for meals, he'd say, "Just eat without me," or leave my portion by the door and go away, reducing the time spent with family. He avoided meeting my or our daughter's eyes, and she began to be scared of him. When he was home, she'd hide in her room. I had no real need to go near the shed, so I avoided it, waiting for him to come out if I needed him. Just being around the shed would sour his mood dramatically. A month later, I realized I needed to start planning for our daughter's birthday celebration. We had been talking about taking a trip. We hadn't done much since she was born, partly because of my husband's work, and partly because we didn't want to disturb others with a too young child. Now that she's grown into a considerate and kind child, I was thinking of splurging on a longer stay than just one night. That meant I might need the large suitcase we used before we were married, so I headed to the shed. I tend to take good care of my belongings, so it would still be usable, despite not having checked it for years due to its storage. My husband had warned me to stay away from the shed, but he was at work today, so it should have been fine. However, as I approached, I heard strange noises coming from the supposedly empty shed. Could it be a burglar? I wondered, peeking through the small window to check, only to find my husband and Emmy in the midst of an intense affair. It felt disgusting, like being forced to watch a cheap adult movie. Of course, the shock that my husband and Emmy were in such a relationship hit me hard, but deep down, I wasn't entirely surprised by his behavior considering recent attitudes. I had naively thought that since Emmy was a close friend, she would reject any advances from my husband. The betrayal by Emmy shook me more profoundly than the distrust towards my husband. When I peeked, their affair seemed to be ending, and they lay side by side, naked, chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened.
She seems clueless, doesn't she?
Given her trauma with love, I'd say she's pretty dense. There were times they felt I was somewhat suspicious, but they laughed, thinking I hadn't realized the extent of their relationship. Emmy said the thrill of not knowing when I might find out was irresistible. However, my husband was a bit cowardly about letting her into the house while I was away, fearing it would be too obvious, so they switched to the shed. They even joked about how disappointed they were that I obediently stayed away from the shed, making it less thrilling since I hadn't caught on, and now they were getting bold.
Scare a girl with love trauma, and she won't come near, right? I want more thrill. How about sneaking out in the middle of a weekday night next time?
Emmy knew my husband and I slept in the same room and was daring him to sneak out without getting caught by me. From the day he warned me off the shed, they had been meeting there on weekends. Emmy, getting carried away, made a shocking revelation. That girl, despite her plain looks, seemed to appeal to guys in high school because she appeared meek. Apparently, Emmy was annoyed that I, being less flashy than her, received attention from male students. And yet, she'd put herself down so obliviously, it drove me nuts, so I took every boyfriend she had. I never belittled myself. What was so wrong about asking someone who professed to like me what exactly they liked about me? The boyfriends I had always cited my quietness, seriousness, and kindness as their reasons, which seemed generic. Still, I was happy they liked me, and I tried to get to know and like them in return. I always thought mutual affection at the time of confession was rare. Learning that Emmy saw me this way and had snatched boyfriends out of jealousy saddened me deeply. Emmy claimed she never actually dated any of the guys she took from me, it was just a game to her. And she'd laugh about how shocked the guys were when she dumped them. I remembered on graduation day, one of my exes apologized for hurting me. I had thought it meant he was sorry for changing his mind after confessing, but after hearing Emmy's story, it clicked that he was apologizing for falling for Emmy's seduction and hurting me. Because it made all the strange things that happened in high school suddenly make sense. While listening to Emmy's boasts, my husband said, "I'm sick of looking at such an ugly face. People say beauties bore you after 3 days, but that's a lie. Facing an ugly person every day is true torture." Anger surged through me, my fists clenching with rage. Bursting through the door and confronting them was one option. But I realized that wouldn't be enough to beat them. They were two, and I was alone. Without evidence, my words would mean nothing, and I would be the one to lose. I thought the best course of action was to carefully plan my revenge while keeping my anger in check. Regarding our daughter's birthday trip, my husband had said he'd leave all the planning to me and our daughter, not participating in any discussions. Moreover, he decided not to join us, citing an absolutely unavoidable work commitment on the day of our daughter's birthday, saying he couldn't take the day off. His insistence on the unavoidable work made me realize he was probably planning to meet up with Emmy. Children often notice more than adults think, and our daughter had realized that her father's moodiness wasn't just about him being irritable. She was scared and didn't want to be in the same space as him, so for her, the fact that he wouldn't be joining the family trip seemed like a blessing. She seemed relieved when I told her. Truth be told, I had no intention of giving up on the trip just because my husband couldn't come. In fact, I was relieved he had opted out. Considering how scared my daughter was of him, a trip without him seemed like the perfect change of scenery. Originally, we had planned a domestic trip assuming my husband would join, as he said he could only take a few days off. But with him not joining, an international trip, which was what our daughter had wanted, became possible. I changed our domestic trip to an international one and extended the duration, sharing this update only with my daughter. When I told her to keep it a secret from Dad, she said, "I wouldn't tell Dad. I'm on your side, Mom." On the day of the trip, as we were heading to the airport by taxi, my daughter boasted, "I did well, didn't I?" saying she had locked up Dad's precious shed. The shed has a lock on the outside, but due to a small mistake by my husband, there are actually 2 keys for the outside. There's the original key that came with the container house and another key he installed on the outside by mistake, meant to keep our daughter from entering during dangerous work. He later added a lock that could only be locked from the inside, totaling 3 locks on the shed. The inside lock can only be operated from within. It wasn't summer yet, but the season could see significant temperature rises during the day. I figured they wouldn't dare use the shed for their secret meetings, especially without telling my husband about the lock situation, and boarded the plane. I remembered my husband once saying the shed felt like a sauna in the summer and wanted to install air conditioning. But I had refused, arguing that a fan and an open window were sufficient for a space only used on weekends. This decision would turn out to play into my plan for revenge. While staying at our travel destination, we received a cryptic message from my in-laws once. It seemed something unexpected had happened at home. But they insisted they'd handle it and told us to enjoy our trip with our daughter to the fullest. Of course, I intended to enjoy the trip with my daughter and had no plans to return early, even if there were issues at home. Because it meant my plan for revenge was unfolding successfully. After thoroughly enjoying the 2-week trip with my daughter, we returned home. Without delay, we went to my in-laws' house after dropping off our luggage, as my daughter wanted to give them souvenirs. I felt bad for using it as an excuse, but it served my purpose. At my in-laws' house, not only were my in-laws present, but my husband was there too, despite it being a time when he was supposed to be at work. He looked very haggard, with an unkempt beard that made him look more intimidating. Seeing him like this, my daughter recoiled and hid behind me. My in-laws immediately started apologizing profusely in front of me. Then my father-in-law began to explain what had happened while my daughter and I were on our trip. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, and seeing my daughter's near-tears face, my mother-in-law took her to another room to keep her company. Actually, I had arranged for my in-laws to use our home while we were away on our trip. After learning my husband wouldn't be joining the family trip, I heard from my in-laws about their plans for a minor renovation at their house. They wanted to do it during a period when they could use a grant, but were hesitant because the work would mean going without water for a while. Indeed, it wasn't summer, but the daytime temperatures could still be quite high, making the lack of water a significant inconvenience. So, I suggested they stay at our place. If we timed our departure with the start of their renovation, my husband would be at work during the day, and they could use the house without any awkwardness. They were very grateful for the suggestion, and plans moved forward. Later, when my husband said his unavoidable work had turned into a business trip, I told my in-laws they could stay over, as it wouldn't matter day or night. I suspected my husband was actually planning a trip with Emmy instead of going on a business trip. On the day, my daughter and I left the house just before noon. I had told my in-laws they were welcome to come over any time as we were leaving. The renovation was scheduled for the afternoon, and after greeting the contractors, they arrived around 2 p.m. Upon arrival, they discovered 2 people collapsed in the front yard. The shed door was also violently broken, indicating something serious had happened, leading to calls to the police and ambulance in a panic. Upon closer inspection, one of the collapsed individuals was my husband. The other was a woman, and for some reason, both were half-naked. Both were semi-conscious, making communication difficult, leading my father-in-law to suspect heatstroke and call an ambulance. The relationship between the two was easy to guess, given they were found together in such a state. The commotion quickly became known to the neighbors, attracting onlookers. One neighbor began explaining how they heard loud noises and then saw a half-naked couple running out of the shed, noting the woman was not the wife, which made the relationship between the two widely known among those present. This wasn't part of my plan, but since my husband's actions became known throughout the neighborhood, I considered it a successful outcome. I'm grateful for my daughter's quick thinking. As I listened to my father-in-law, I put on an act of being shocked. When I was a child, concerned about my introverted nature, my mother had enrolled me in a children's theater group. Recalling the coaching from back then, I tried to act as naturally as possible, earning my father-in-law's sympathy as he harshly reprimanded my husband. I reassured my father-in-law that I was okay and then confessed that I had installed a camera in the shed. It was initially set up to catch evidence of my husband's affair, but I explained to my husband and in-laws that I installed it because I was scared of the strange noises coming from the shed, thinking they might be wild animals. I thought it was just animals, but who would have thought, my husband having an affair, right? I casually mentioned. As I said this and looked at my husband, he looked back at me with a look of "What have you done?" My father-in-law, sensing the urgency, pushed me to check the footage quickly. My mother-in-law offered to keep looking after our daughter, allowing us to rush back to our house. My husband was somewhat dragged along by my father-in-law, obviously reluctant since he didn't want the evidence of his deeds to be seen. That's because the evidence of the affair is still there, and he wouldn't want his father-in-law to see it. However, when we reached the shed, he began to throw a tantrum like a 3-year-old. My husband protested about privacy invasion and suddenly feeling dizzy, and when those excuses weren't accepted, he just yelled about it being irrelevant and that he didn't want this. I thought to myself, If you're doing something that you don't want seen or known, then you shouldn't do it in secret. He had enjoyed the thrill of possibly getting caught, so shouldn't he have been prepared for the possibility of getting caught? In the end, my husband couldn't stand against my father-in-law's force and had to enter the shed. My father-in-law has been practicing martial arts since he was young and still goes to the local dojo to teach kids. My physically inactive husband had no chance against him. The camera in the shed captured my husband sneaking back into the yard and into the shed after saying he was going on a business trip. The camera was discreetly installed not just inside the shed but also at the entrance to catch anyone unnoticed. Once inside, Emmy was already there waiting. It seems they had created a space in the hedge for one person to get through to the yard without me noticing, placing something in front of it that even a woman could move to deceive me. Waiting for my husband in the storage room, Emmy was already in her underwear and seemed eager to do it. My husband, perhaps lustful at the sight of her, jumped on Emmy like an animal and repeated the violent, constant action. There was a moment when their activity abruptly stopped, captured by the entrance camera, showing my daughter approaching the shed. Despite being engrossed in their actions, they seemed sensitive to any sounds. They could have waited for us to leave for their secret meeting, but choosing to meet while we were still home was part of the thrill they sought, I suppose. Once my daughter moved away from the shed area, they resumed. They probably hadn't considered that my daughter might lock the padlock from the outside. Later, the camera installed at the entrance recorded the sound of a taxi arriving and my voice calling to my daughter, "Let's go," clearly audible. This must have reached the ears of the two inside because, as the taxi drove away, the camera inside the shed captured them stopping their intimate actions and attempting to leave the shed. However, footage showed my husband's confusion as the door wouldn't open, and Emmy peering out through the small window, trying to figure out the door's situation. Even the slim Emmy seemed to struggle to exit through the small window because her shoulders got in the way. Unable to determine the door's condition and growing increasingly frustrated, my husband's tone became aggressive. "If that's the case, you can just dislocate your joints and squeeze through that small window. You're a man, act like it." "What? Wanting to feel the thrill and hiding before my wife leaves was your idea, not mine. I wouldn't be in this mess if I hadn't gone along with your thrill-seeking." The bickering that ensued between them, now far from their earlier affectionate behavior, had me struggling to hold back laughter. Trapped in the sealed shed, the temperature inside was rising rapidly. Unable to find a way out and without a key, the pair were sweating profusely, resembling people stuck in a sauna. Dehydrated from sweating, their risk of heatstroke skyrocketed, seemingly leading to the condition's onset. Both my husband and Emmy must have had their phones on them. They could have just called for emergency services while dressed, I thought. It seems people's judgment falters when they engage in guilty pleasures. My father-in-law seemed to have expected something like this, but facing the reality was different from just suspecting it. My husband, already facing a stern rebuke from my father-in-law, could only shrink smaller under his fiery wrath. I became so concerned that my father-in-law might collapse from his excessive anger that I found myself worrying more about him than the situation at hand. I was so busy trying to suppress my laughter that my body shook. My father-in-law mistook me for breaking down in tears. Using that to my advantage, I made it look like I was crying and said I couldn't go on. I wanted a divorce. While emotional wounds can't be healed with money, I expressed my desire for compensation in the form of alimony, to which my father-in-law strongly agreed, saying it was the right decision. He promised to make my husband pay alimony, and forced him, who hadn't uttered a single apology, to see my eyes and say sorry. My father-in-law also said he'd make my husband pay for a new place to live, reasoning that I wouldn't want to stay in a house tainted by infidelity. My husband started to object, saying, "Why should I?" but wilted under my father-in-law's gaze, sharper than any gang's, and meekly agreed to comply. Having been strictly disciplined by my father-in-law, a former athlete, since he was young, my husband has a tendency to follow his words, possibly out of trauma. Thanks to this, under my father-in-law's direction, everything went smoothly. After checking the camera and gathering my belongings, we returned to my in-laws' house, and then I moved to a hotel with my daughter. We decided to stay there until we found a new place, with my father-in-law insisting on my husband covering the costs. We opted for a rental apartment instead of a house, choosing a new building that was about to be completed and moving in as soon as it was ready. Right before we were set to move in, I received a call from Emmy. I could guess the gist of what Emmy wanted, but decided to answer to avoid any further complications.
Don't you dare contact my ex-husband, you ugly thing.
Her true nature seemed to reveal itself through her vile language and classless shouting, further criticizing me in a shrill voice, telling me not to show off my happiness just because I'm plain, or saying I don't know how to please a man. It's audacious. Speaking of which, there was a conversation between my husband and Emmy on the camera where my husband criticized our intimate life, saying, "She just lies there like a decoration, so boring." Probably, my husband often complained that our marital life was dull.
Because I thought your ex-husband was making a valid point.
In fact, before I suspected the affair between Emmy and my husband, I received a call from someone claiming to be Emmy's ex-husband. He told me Emmy had vanished without paying alimony or child support. The message was about expanding Emmy's social circle to investigate her whereabouts. It seems someone suggested to him that I might know Emmy's whereabouts. When I received the call, Emmy had told me she was fleeing from an abusive ex, so thinking she was still being pursued post-divorce, I said I didn't know anything. But after learning the truth about Emmy and my husband, and her past betrayals, I asked a mutual friend about the real reason for Emmy's divorce. The friend didn't know the true reason, but they shared rumors that were completely different from what Emmy had told me. I then contacted the person who claimed to be Emmy's ex-husband, and heard a story very similar to the rumors. Emmy apparently had a child but showed no interest in parenting, always leaving the child with her ex-husband. She neglected child-rearing and household duties, indulging in flashy affairs. When her ex-husband reached his limit and initiated a divorce, Emmy left the child with him and disappeared. Though she agreed to pay alimony and child support at the time of the divorce, she never did. She vanished as if fleeing in the night, and he had been searching for her since. The child's photo he showed me looked exactly like Emmy as a child. I had known Emmy since elementary school, but we lost touch when she moved due to her father's job, only to reconnect in high school. Believing her ex-husband's story, I informed him of Emmy's location, and I told him everything she was doing to my husband.
Valid point? Ridiculous. I've always hated how you play the good girl. It's disgusting.
No matter what Emmy said, I ignored it. Engaging emotionally with someone like her was a waste. Even spending time on her felt like a waste. I told Emmy I would also demand compensation from her, which left her momentarily speechless. When I mentioned knowing everything she did in high school, she excused it as just a game and that the men misunderstood on their own. Emmy might see it as just a game, but among those caught up in her game, there were people who got hurt. At least, that was true for me and the ex-boyfriend who apologized to me. I told her we would communicate through lawyers in the future and hung up. Afterward, my husband returned to work, only to learn a hard lesson about not being arrogant. It seems he had a habit of looking down on those he considered beneath him. You know, the type who has one face for home and another for work. My husband was the textbook example, especially cruel to subordinates he deemed useless. One of these subordinates had coincidentally moved into our neighborhood and was among the onlookers when my husband was taken away half-naked by the ambulance. Even more, he had recorded it on his smartphone and spread it as payback for how he was treated at work. With the solidarity of other similarly mistreated subordinates, the spread of this video was incredibly fast, and naturally, the news of the affair became widely known. Feeling uncomfortable at work, my husband resigned, but due to his short tenure, his severance pay was minimal. He tried to seek refuge with my in-laws but was ignored and not even allowed inside their house. His attempts at finding a new job failed as it turned out he was all talk and no action, unable to secure employment. The relentless demands for child support and alimony meant he had to juggle multiple part-time jobs. I heard he's now in a position where he's being told he's less useful than a student part-timer, the very words he used to say to his subordinates. As a result, he keeps hopping from one job to another, unable to hold down a steady position. Since they can't accumulate a substantial amount of money, it seems they have no choice but to work without any days off. Emmy was taken back by her ex-husband and is now under strict surveillance by him and his family. She was dumped into a company known to her ex-husband, notorious for its harsh working conditions. It's a job that needs doing, but due to its danger and unpopularity, it pays well. Given that few people manage to stay long, it must be an environment more challenging than one can imagine. It seems Emmy is being reformed as a person, returning exhausted to the company dormitory every day without the spare energy to engage in affairs or snatch anyone's boyfriend. By the time payday arrives, her ex-husband has already deducted alimony and child support. In the end, they are left with an amount even lower than what a student part-time job would pay. Since she lives in a company dormitory, rent and utilities are deducted up front. Considering only food expenses are out of pocket, her ex-husband remarked that she should manage, informing me of Emmy's current situation. A few days later, I was notified that Emmy had attempted to escape due to the harsh conditions. But her movements were constantly monitored, and she was quickly found and brought back, receiving a severe reprimand that seemingly broke her spirit. Since then, there's been no sign of her trying to escape, and I've heard she's become quite submissive. My daughter and I have started a new life in our new home. Separated from my husband and knowing she wouldn't have to meet him unless she wanted to, my daughter has gradually returned to her cheerful self, stabilizing emotionally after the turmoil caused by my husband's behavior. Actually, I've always enjoyed obtaining certifications, and during my college years and even after getting married, I acquired several through distance learning. One of them has been particularly useful in job transitions. Though I became a stay-at-home mom after getting married and giving birth, I worked from home as much as I could. Now, I've decided to work full-time at an office. I might make my daughter feel a bit lonely, but I believe she'll understand. From now on, it's just the two of us, side by side, living a happy life, I told her. My daughter confidently replied, "I'll protect mommy." It seems this ordeal has taught my daughter something profound. I've vowed to live each day to the fullest to protect my daughter's smile.